Welcome to So You Want to Be a Candidate. Thank you, Troy, for that earlier introduction. My name is Andrew Lawton from True North, and it is my great privilege to be here to talk to three very esteemed panelists who have been there in the trenches. They've been candidates. I have as well, but unlike them, I was not successful. So don't listen to what I have to say about being a candidate. Listen to these three great folks. We have joining us remotely Lisa Raitt, who is a former cabinet minister who's now moved to the private sector. We have Rebecca Shulz, who is the MLA for Calgary Shaw, and also the Minister of Children's Services in Alberta, and Preston Manning, who probably doesn't need an introduction, but we'll give him one anyway so he doesn't feel left out, the founder of the Reform Party, longtime advocate in the Conservative movement in Canada. Lisa, Rebecca, Preston, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
So the panel is called So You Want to Be a Candidate. The first question that I need to ask, why on earth would you want to be a candidate? And I thought this would be a great opportunity to get all of you to explain what it was that made you decide to be a candidate, and also speak to, in that, what are some of the other reasons that people considering being a candidate should really be thinking about in this. And I'll start with you, Rebecca. I mean, why on earth would you want to be a candidate in this day and age?
Well, we were joking before the session began. Maybe you don't. No, I'm just joking. I wouldn't change a thing, really. And part of my decision was really, I had been involved in politics. I had worked in politics. And for me, it was unity really matters for the Conservative movement. And when the Wild Rose and the Progressive Conservatives came together in Alberta, I thought, you know, this is a new party, and this is an opportunity for me to see myself represented in Conservative politics, being a young working mom representing working families. And I just thought, you know, I have experience. I have a supportive spouse who also worked in politics. And so if not someone like me, why not someone like me? And so had somebody to plant the seed. And really it was, you know, I thought, oh, that's so nice of them for thinking I could run. And then I thought, hey, I have wanted to run, and maybe this is my time. And at the time I had a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old daughter. And I just remember thinking, you know, we are told as women, sometimes we think about it, we have to be asked multiple times. And I hope that she learns, and my son as well, that if you have something to offer and you have skills to share, that you should just put your name forward and do something about it, and get over that fear of, you know, what if you lose? What if you don't win? How is this going to go? And just put your name forward and do the work. So that was kind of my story.
I'll give you the same question, Preston. And things have changed, obviously, a lot in Canadian politics since the Reform Party. But why would someone want to be a candidate, and why should someone want to be a candidate?
Well, I think one should distinguish between, some people get into politics out of personal ambition, and other people get into politics to try to serve the country or their constituency or their community in some way. I think it's a lot better to be on the service side than the personal ambition side. I was raised in a political family. My father was a long time involved in provincial politics. He always used to say, even when he was running a government, that the province can always be governed better. The country can be governed better. The democratic system can be made better. So I kind of had it in my head that it could be done better. And I was familiar with the West's history of producing these new political parties. I used to have this debate with Joe Clark way back in university. Joe was committed at age 16 to the Conservative Party, and he didn't think it was perfect, but he thought he could work within it and improve it that way. And I used to say, well, every now and every 20 years or so, the West produces a new movement, like the old Progressives, the Farmers' Parties, the CCF, the Social Credit. I think I'll wait around until the next wave. So that's how I got in. But I think this deciding whether you're in it for service or for personal ambition is a pretty good dividing point.
Lisa, what was your why?
Well, my why was I was angry about a decision Paul Martin had made that had an impact on the Toronto Port Authority, of which I was CEO at the time. He decided to cancel an infrastructure project that he did for political reasons. And I guess over the summer, it really got into my head. And by the time I got to the fall of 2008, it was either you're going to do something about it or you're going to stew on it. And when I was approached by the Conservatives, when I was approached to run in my riding, which, by the way, Andrew, you'll remember this, my riding was won by Garth Turner, who then crossed the floor. So I was running against an ex an ex-conservative MP, I guess, in a sense. But it was really just because I was upset. And I thought, you know what, I can make better decisions than that. And I want to do what's right when we get to Ottawa and not what is politically expedient.
And I'll tell all the candidates, feel free to jump in at any moment here if you have something to add. But Lisa ends on, I think, an important point to explore there, which is that a lot of candidates are motivated not because they want to be candidates, but because they want what comes on the end of a winning campaign. They want to be in office. And people have all these grand ideas about what it is they're going to do when they get to Ottawa or Edmonton or Toronto or even a local city council. But a lot of them don't think about that step that comes in between. First, you've got to win, and first you've got to be a candidate. And the mindset for an elected official and a candidate are very different. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, Preston. I mean, what is it that someone who wants to seek office needs to understand about that first role, which is critically important because without it, you don't get to do what comes next?
Well, I think it's very important to make that decision. And if you're involved in candidate recruitment, it creates a dilemma. Sometimes the person that would make the best candidate, and if you've got this job description of a candidate and the kind of skills that are required, et cetera, doesn't necessarily make the best MP or MLA or city councillor. And I guess when you're involved in candidate recruitment, you try to find the best of both. Somebody who is electable, but they're more than just electable. If they do get there, they've got the skills, they've got the background, they've got the character to serve in that capacity. And candidate recruitment is a huge thing. In fact, I have a lot of grandsons that play hockey, and you know, when they get to be about 11 or 12, you go to the arena at 6 in the morning. There's some grizzled old guy sitting on the back row of the balcony with a clipboard. Who is that guy? He's a scout, and some of those are scouts for the NHL teams, scouting 11 and 12-year-olds. Where's the scouting system for our political parties? Yeah. Who's out there not thinking about next year, but thinking 10 years ahead, you know, and trying to identify that person that is electable, but also can serve if you get them elected?
Yeah, what were you going to say, Lisa?
I was going to say Doug Findlay was that grizzled old scout watching, me take on Paul Martin's government from my lowly perch as the CEO of the Toronto Port Authority, and flew in to come and ask me whether or not I would consider running. And to be honest, I would not have put my hand up or my name forward had I not been asked. Like many women, they don't think about pursuing that kind of path until you get there. And Preston, I wanted to mention that I was brought up in a bit of a political family as well. My grandfather was a local municipal politician. He was an alderman, but he was also very much involved with the CCF, which I had not heard from a long time until you mentioned it just now as you went through the litany of different parties, I guess, throughout the years.
Yeah, interesting.
This is, I think, an important point for candidates to realize, because there are a lot of star candidates like Lisa that are going to be recruited and really encouraged, but there are also candidates that are unknown to party apparatus that can really just work hard, sell memberships, win a nomination, and have a lot of success. And I know that there have been a number of very successful candidates who have become successful politicians that weren't insiders by any stretch. They didn't know people. They just were hard workers. And how... First off, do you think that the system allows for that still? And do you think that it is still possible for a candidate that just says, you know what, I think I have the skills, even if I haven't been in politics before, I can do this?
I mean, I would say that's kind of my story. When I decided to put my name forward, I had worked in politics in Saskatchewan, and so I worked for Premier Wall. My political career was largely there. Moved to Alberta because I had always wanted to live in Calgary. I love Alberta, and I kind of started to dip my toe into politics, but really wasn't known. I had a small child at home, and so, you know, was working and volunteering a little bit here and there, but I really didn't have any of those connections. And I remember I had been listening to Ronna Ambrose, and she spoke at the founding UCP AGM and said, you know, women will often tell themselves, or in my case, I had people give me this advice: wait till you have an MBA, wait till you have a law degree, you know, do a little bit more on boards, get a little bit more experience, and then, you know, people will ask you to run. And I thought, okay, you know, sure, there's that, but I also would really just like to run. And, you know, I want to see, like I said, myself, young working families represented in Conservative politics. And so I did that. I decided to run in the nomination. I didn't have I didn't have any volunteers. I door knocked by myself for the first 2 months of a nomination every single day by myself, just got out there, knocked on doors, sold memberships. I joke I had no campaign manager other than my husband, who was kind of part-time trying to give me advice, but mostly to stay out of my way to preserve our marriage. And then, I had a couple of people to bounce ideas off of, which was really just the people who could remind you, don't listen to the noise, stay off social media, you don't need to go to the events, you don't need to seek out the media opportunities, you really just need to go knock on doors and meet with your constituents. And so, I didn't have any of that. I also didn't have any donors, right? No donors, no volunteers, no campaign team, just me. And over time, when you meet people, and this is where, that's a skill that, now as an elected official, my job is still to connect with people, to have the hard conversations, to listen to their feedback, and to take their ideas and their voice and try to not only bring that forward, but then use that as you're creating and advocating for different policies in government.
Candidate spouses do deserve a very honorable mention here because they put up with a lot. They lose their spouse. I mean, my wife was the most patient woman in the world for being married to me in general, but especially when I was running a few years back. But also, they're not the one that's getting the gain, because even if you're successful, that further takes you away from them. So spouses of candidates do put up with a lot. So I'm glad you honored yours, and I think we can all honor ours as well.
Some spouses would be better than the candidate.
Yes.
Like my wife Sandra is a very outgoing person, much more than I am. And when I first ran in Calgary Southwest, she came along with me. My campaign manager was Harry Robinson, who used to be the principal of Western Canada High. He came to me and said he says, you got to leave her at home. I said, why is that? He says, because people are coming to me and say, how come she's not the candidate? Why is the old policy wonk here? She's
yeah.
So you got to be careful with that. Yeah.
You mentioned door knocking, and I think this is a very important point that can't be understated, because there are a lot of candidates that I've talked to that almost think it's beneath them when they first enter politics. And you got people that come into this having had very successful careers. They've been CEOs, they've been high-powered lawyers, they've worked in all these things, and then they have to go door to door, knocking on houses one at a time, asking for votes. Lisa, were you prepared for that when you first ran? Because you were in that position. You had been a very successful lawyer. You were the head of the Toronto Port Authority. Were you prepared to just burn through running shoes when you first ran?
Yep. And I followed exactly along the same lines. I was on my own at the very beginning of the campaign. It was me and my father, and I think I had one volunteer that came in from Toronto, and we just went door to door. And you learn on the fly. But one of the qualities that I hope candidates can channel, or at least they have, when they embark upon this, is you have to have a lot of humility. And you have to be able to put yourself out there and listen to other people. Like Rebecca said, it's very important to have that empathetic ear and the ability to handle whatever may come at you on the doorstep. I think it's absolutely essential. And if you're not out there door knocking and showing people that you are going to put your face behind what your party says, they're not going to take you seriously, Andrew. You just have to be there. In every campaign, we went out there and we hit 30,000 doors, and that's what you have to do. And the end of it, when I didn't campaign this time around in 2021, because I didn't run, I actually kind of missed it. I didn't know what to do with myself. Federal election, and I'm not walking around door to door. So I went and helped some friends.
And the parties could provide more training for door knocking. Door knocking, there's certain things you can learn. Like, how do you handle the worst situations? Like, my worst situation was I ran in Yellowhead riding, which is a big rural riding against Joe Clark in whenever that was, 1988. And I was in this town of Swan Hills, the oil field town, and I should have stopped. It was getting dark, but anyway, I leaped up on this guy's porch. His puppy came out. I stepped on the puppy's foot. The puppy starts howling like I don't know what, and he grabbed the dog and went inside to come out with his wife came out to see what the fuss was about. So here's the question for a candidate. What do you say in a town where dogs are more highly valued than politicians, and you've just almost killed a guy's dog? So what I said was, good evening, I'm running for Parliament, and my name is Joe Clark. Joe never forgave me for that.
You heard it here first. This is, I think, a very interesting point. And by the way, I will say, I ran into Lisa when I was covering the campaign in North Sydney, and you were so free at the same time by not having to worry about it. So Yes, you had earned your right to sit that election out after your years of service. I'm going to put this out to anyone who wants to jump in on this, because I think Lisa touched on a very important point here, which is you can't take it personally. We know that a lot of people are very polarized about politics, and we know that when you're a candidate, a lot of the times people's animus towards you has nothing to do with you. It's because they don't like the party, they don't like the leader, or they may not just like politicians in general. How do you protect yourself against it? Because I don't think most people want to talk about, oh, these poor hard done by politicians, but there is a personal toll when you're going around and you're asking for people's vote, and a third of the people, 25%, however many, are slamming the door in your face or are not happy to see you. So how do you sort of check yourself and protect yourself against that? Whoever wants to take that.
I think for me it was kind of just practice, and I joke about my spouse being one of the most important people in my political life, but I remember somebody had said something on social media and it was kind of keeping me awake at night, and he said, if that's going to get under your skin, this may not be the best job for you. And I was like, you're right, that shouldn't get under my skin, and it's not personal. And I think to what Lisa said, politics for me is about hard work and humility and honesty. And so for me, as long as every day, people are going to disagree. It's not always personal, but I think that's where it's really important to take the time to ask the question, where are you coming from? What's your frustration? Is it something I can fix? Is it not something I can fix? Because sometimes there's something that's creating that frustration that has nothing to do with the actual situation. And so for me, that is, I think, an open door for sometimes a future conversation or just to agree to disagree. But I think too, maybe the more practice, like go knock on a few more doors. You find some that are supportive, you find some people that are frustrated, and with practice, you're able to kind of, withstand some of those more difficult interactions. But I think from all of them, positive or maybe not so positive, they are something that you can learn from. So I think, I am an optimist, even though I have chosen politics, or especially because I have chosen politics. But, to take that and say, what can I learn from this?
Well, I think you raise a very important question. I think that the biggest single, like I said, I've been involved in candidate recruitment provincially and federally since 1968. And the biggest single reason that's given today by, you get a list, you got 4 or 5 people, these people would be, they've got the skills, they've got the experience, they've got the character, and number 1 won't go, number 2 won't go, number 3 won't go. And why won't they go? The biggest single reason today is I will not subject myself, and usually their family, they mention the family, I will not subject them to the abuse that you get in the political arena today, particularly from the media and particularly from the social media. And how to answer, I'm not sure what answers that question, because it's getting worse. And it's the biggest reason now why good people won't touch the political arena.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of people say that because of that, the only candidates you're left with are those who have never really said or done anything of note, because they just have this sort of squeaky clean slate. So how do you get good candidates that are not going to be scared of that? And I know, Lisa, this is something that parties have contended with. It's something you've seen by virtue of being in cabinet and being in politics, where the media drags you through the ringer. How do you convince someone to overlook that if they check all the boxes on what's going to be a great candidate and a great representative, but they don't want to go through that?
So when I was deputy leader to Andrew Scheer, oftentimes I would be brought in to try to close the deal on a female candidate. And Preston's exactly correct. That's what we would run into in terms of trying to convince them that that they were doing the right thing. They were, seeking to represent their community is such a high calling and an incredible honor to do so. And we think that you would be a great candidate. And it's tough to get through that discussion. But I'm going to level with you. I mean, if you looked at the Globe and Mail this week and you saw Annamie Paul indicate that this was the worst experience of her life, what woman out there, what BIPOC member of society out there would think, why would I go into this if this is the way it's going to end in the Green Party of Canada? So that is not a really good, I would say, example of how people can be treated well when they become candidates or helped when they become candidates. And just going back to the other question, if I may, Andrew, one thing I've noticed since I've gone back into the private sector, I work at CIBC now, where they have tons of training. And some of the training that you receive is how to have difficult conversations and how to deal with difficult situations, either in managing people or in customer relations. And I'm with Preston. I mean, the more training, the better for our folks as they go door to door. I think would be remarkable, even a few skills on how to do it, because there's a whole body of work out there, and it's recognized that it's a really tough thing to try to learn on your own.
Yeah.
That I think is very important. And one of the advantages that I had, again, keeping in mind I lost, but when I ran as a candidate, is that years earlier I had volunteered on campaigns. So I knew what a campaign was like. I had knocked on someone's door and asked for a vote before. Not for me, but I had done it before. A lot of candidates have no political experience. They've never volunteered on a campaign. And I'm curious if you think that would be a significantly beneficial thing for someone to have run who had volunteered in the past and knew, even when they weren't the one on the ballot.
Well, I'd back up one step from that to what Lisa said, that recognizing that training is important, that you ought to try to get some training. I always quote the old Roman senator Cicero, who was as politically ambitious at a young age as you'd ever get, but he wrote in his diary in Latin, intrate parati, enter prepared, enter prepared. And the guy took 10 years getting ready to get into the Roman Senate. And I think establishing this fact that you need training, then you can start going, where can I get it? I mean, the parties have some training, mainly for candidacy, not for how to be an elected official. There's programs. I was involved in helping to get this graduate program in political management at Carleton University. There's the Institute for Future Legislators that UBC has got. There's a few programs like that. And then to your point, referenda campaigns are excellent training grounds for electoral campaigns. You do all the same sort of thing. You distribute literature, you knock on doors, you collect money. So involving yourself in some kind as a volunteer, as a constituency person, is something, even in a referendum campaign, is a great preparation for an election campaign.
Would training have helped you, Rebecca? Because you seem to be the type of candidate you described. You know, you didn't really have a lot of experience. You were just out there, you and your husband. Would training have been something you would have jumped at?
You know, it would have. And especially when I go back to thinking about it, as a nomination contestant at the time, you know, that's when you're kind of out there on your own. And then there's training for once you've already become a candidate and your name is on the ballot. But by then you've knocked a lot of doors. So I do think something like that would be helpful. I mean, I did have the benefit of having knocked a lot of doors in other provincial mostly, but also some federal campaigns. And so you do somewhat learn on the go, but it still is different when it's you. And so there is a difference in door knocking for, you know, a current premier or, you know, a current sitting party or, you know, an already existing candidate that is well known or just someone other than you, because then all of a sudden, and I don't know if this was just something I faced or maybe, you know, Lisa, Preston, you did as well, but, you know, it is different when you are the product, you are the person, you know, and even in a nomination, the first thing I had to get my head around is, I'm not door knocking for Conservatives. I'm door knocking and I am campaigning against 4 other Conservatives. And really what I have to do is convince people that I am going to be the best choice to be their voice in their MLA. That's a different kind of door knocking all on its own. And so I do think training is helpful because it's always a little bit different when it's your name on the ballot.
Well, and all our discussion here is on training to be a candidate. I think there's training to be an elected official. Like, you know, I know people that got the House of Commons, and when this bill was put on their desk, it's not quite like this. They almost said, "What's that?" Like, and somebody had to say, "You make statute law. That's what you do here." But there's no training. The parties provide no training on lawmaking, on representation. There's 3 big theories of representation: trusteeship theory, mandate theory, delegate theory. What do you do when your personal position, the position of your party, and the position of your constituents is different? What do you do? You better think that through before you become the elected representative, not after. Like these are all, this is beyond the getting elected. This is training for that job. And if the parties don't do it or somebody doesn't do it, you know who's ready to do it? The bureaucracy. The bureaucracy. They will train you. I knew, he was from originally, I won't give his name, a deputy minister in Ottawa. I had a row with him. He had a loose leaf on the training of cabinet ministers. And it started with where the washroom was, and it went to orders in council and everything else. And I got after him. I said, it's not your business to do that. These people are working for their constituents and their party, they're not working for you. And then he got mad at me. He says, but I have had people here who knew so little about what this job was, that if I hadn't done this, they'd have got into trouble, we'd have got into trouble. What else am I to do? He says, you political people don't train your people for this, and if you don't, we will. So that's another whole bag, and you probably ran into a deputy who had some ideas about how to train you.
Let's start with the federal on that, Lisa. Did you find there was...
Lisa's had the most experience in this.
Did you find, Lisa, there was a mentorship, either officially or unofficially, that you were able to enjoy going from private life to being a member of parliament, and even to go one step further when you went from being a member of parliament in opposition to a cabinet minister? Did you have someone that could really show you that process?
Nope. There is a letter that was sent to me by a friend, Jeff Steiner, that was drafted, I think, Preston, you probably remember, I think it was a former clerk of the Privy Council wrote a phantom letter called Dear Minister. And it kind of goes through not the legal way in which law is made, but the kinds of decisions you're going to be faced with and soft kind of advice of things that you should do. But basically that's it. But you do receive, a mandate letter from the Prime Minister. You receive codes of conduct. You receive all kinds of information from that point of view of how you should manage your affairs. But what it comes down to is you walk into that office and the deputy minister is there and ready to brief you on everything. And you're going to have to rely upon your political staff to make sure that what you're getting is the information that's pertinent and doesn't have a spin on it. Not saying that the bureaucracy is going to spin you, but they have their point of view. And a government is elected because they have their point of view. And the two are supposed to work together to get the best outcome for citizens. And I would just give you the example. One of the first things that a deputy minister will put in front of you is this giant list of decisions that they want you as minister to defer to them as the deputy minister. And, some ministers just sign off on the top and others go through one by one to see if you're willing to relinquish your power on certain things. And it's an interesting exercise. And the first time out, I was very cautious. Actually, I was cautious every single time. But and sometimes you take back some of your powers.
And sometimes there can be real conflict. Jean Chrétien tells a story about, you remember way back, you people are all too young for this, but when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister, he spent money like a drunken sailor. Well, I know some other people spent money.
Well, the young people are still paying for it, so we do have some familiarity.
But anyway, I had some meeting somewhere where he actually got convinced he did have to start doing something about the budget, and he went on TV. Chrétien was his finance minister, and Trudeau went on TV saying, we're going to balance the budget. So Chrétien says he hauled in his deputy. He was finance minister. He hauled in his deputy minister the next day and said, the boss says we have to balance the budget. He said, give me a list of things we can cut. So the deputy goes away. Chrétien swears this actually happened. He came back a few hours later with a list. And on the top of the list was a park in Shawinigan, which was Chrétien's writing. And so Chrétien says, he said, the park, it is in my writing, And the guy, he says, looked him in the eye and said, Minister, something is always in somebody's writing. It was just a shot across the bow. We can do this, but it can be a painful exercise. And this is the contest in a way between the elected person and the bureaucracy, and it's not always an easy one, and it's not always an easy one for the elected person to win if you don't have the skills to do it.
We'll go to you, Rebecca. You're the most recently elected of the three members of the panel here. Had these issues been resolved by the time you were first elected? Did you find there was a training module, formal or more of an informal mentorship that you could benefit from?
There was some training, I would say, and a lot of it is mostly process-based, like Lisa said. And, I think maybe what was unique for me is I had worked in a premier's office, and I had also worked as a public servant. And so when I ran, I'm the first to say I never expected to be an MLA and a minister in the same day at the same time. So there is always going to be a learning experience. And so the best advice I got was call all of the folks that you knew, the ministers, the MLAs that you worked with, Get their advice. What is their advice on staying organized in your constituency office, making sure that you're keeping on top of keeping in touch with all of the people who got you there in the first place. And then also trying to balance learning a portfolio and a file and manage the briefing binders that, Lisa, they send it up, and there is always this urgent list of things that has just happened to be waiting for you as you walk into the door. And knowing, I think, the questions to ask to get the right information to make the right decisions, that's the advice that I essentially reached out to people who I'd worked with and respected to say, how do you do that? How do you balance the roles? And what do you tackle first? And what are the things I don't know? Knowing that I'm okay to admit that there's a lot of things that I didn't know, even having been around politics. So I would say there is some training, but I think, that is probably something, whether it is, mentorship, as you mentioned, whether that's formal or informal, I think those are things that are really helpful.
You mentioned earlier, Preston, the social media issue when you're talking about what a candidate has to contend with. And this, I think, drives home a broader point here, which is that politics has changed in a way. But it's also remained very similar in a lot of ways. You still have to go out and, one voter at a time, win people over. What are, looking back on your first campaign and now, what would you say are the biggest things that have just completely been unchanging and the biggest things that I think are very, very different now?
Well, at the end of the day, you still have to get elected, so that doesn't change. But I think the social media have very much changed the political landscape. And on the one hand, you can see, there's the opportunity through the social media and through the internet generally for millions of people to get information and participate in ways that could never have participated before. So there's that positive side. But it also can be used in this negative sense to the point that it's a great deterrent to people running for office. I didn't answer this question when you raised it earlier, but what can one do to protect oneself from the abuse, including by the social media? One way, and the way I use it, you can build a hard shell around yourself where you can actually resolve that. I'm not going to let any of that get to me. I'm not going to let it get to me emotionally. And that is one way to do it. And that's basically the way I did it. The only danger in that is if you build up that shell long enough and hard enough and thick enough, there are certain emotional messages in that should get through to you, even ones from your family and others. But you build up this shell, and it can become a liability too. But that is one strategy, build up the shell, but be careful it's not that it lets something through that it should let through,
I won't tell the name of the MP. Lisa might know from the story because she served with him in politics. But there was an MP years and years ago that I canvassed with who we lost him. We couldn't find the candidate during the canvass. And 30 minutes later, he emerges from the house and tells us about this great conversation he had with someone who had immigrated to Canada from some country and had started a business. And we said, okay, well, is he going to take a lawn sign? Well, no, he's not a citizen. He can't vote. And that was 30 minutes of a canvass that was lost basically because there was no vote there. And I'm curious, and I'll start with you on this, Lisa. You're out there to get votes. It's a matter of speed, but you also want to meet people. And how do you find, and how did you find in your campaigns, especially earlier on, before you had name recognition, before you had the benefit of incumbency, that instinct that you have just to talk to people versus knowing that you've got to do it in this very methodical, almost machine-like way of, identify the vote, move on, identify the vote, move on?
I am not a machine. I'm the problem, Andrew. I'm like you or that unnamed member of parliament. I would be the one who would be chatting and chatting and chatting. So they always had someone come back to scoop me out just to make sure that I wasn't lagging too far behind. Now, as you know, the candidate goes to the doors that open. When you're really working with a lot of people and you have a lot of folks helping you door knock, you wait for the doors that open, and that's where the candidate goes to try to talk to the person one-on-one. It's interesting. I actually had that situation happen in the last canvass in 2021 because we hit a door. The person obviously was not, it was not obvious. They told us that they were not going to be able to vote because they were not a Canadian citizen yet. And we still spent some time. And I thought as I walked away, part of the reason why we spent a little bit of time and why I felt good about it was that person may not be a Canadian citizen or have the franchise. However, they do have a community, and they talk to their friends and they talk to their neighbors. And if they have a good personal experience with you at the door and you convince them to look at your candidacy, that's a good thing as well. Word of mouth in the community is extremely, extremely important, especially if you're an authentic candidate, someone that's likable, someone that can add points to the points that the leader is already putting up for you.
I guess on that note, Rebecca, do you find that there might be too much of an emphasis perhaps in some of the official wisdom of canvassing, that it may be too limited to just identify the mode and move on?
You know, I'm similar to Lisa in that I know that, you know, obviously you need to move quick because there's a lot of doors to knock in a campaign, right? And you want to meet as many people as possible. And whether you're in a nomination and you're selling memberships, or you're, you know, in a general election and you're trying to connect with as many people as possible, I think there is a knowledge in, you know, when you know that somebody is just going to agree to disagree, not going to support you. Like, I do understand, you know, that there is, you know, you don't want to maybe stay for half an hour on every door. You'd run out of time. But at the same time, I agree with what Lisa said. There were people who told me when I first door knocked that nobody had knocked on their door in over 10 years. People who were conservative, people who were excited to see somebody who wanted to listen to them. And then they started talking to their neighbors. And then I started knocking on doors. The doors would open and I would hear things like, wait, you know, we're just running our kids to hockey. Can you come back tomorrow? And I thought, well, this is very strange. You know, that this is not something that I've ever really experienced before. But sure enough, it was neighbors talking about, you know, this person who wasn't, you know, one of the women told me, look, all these other people came around and they had these lists of names and they knew who was in my household. And you just came and you knocked on every door and you talked to every one of my friends and you knew every single concern that my neighbors had. And, you know, I think sometimes you just, I mean, I think of my intuition, but I just know that sometimes you just got to connect with people. And that's important too. Although, you know, I know all of the people who gave me all of the advice on how to campaign are probably thinking right now, what is she talking about?
Yeah, there's a party campaign manager screaming at the computer right now.
She's knocking on doors. But, you know, and I say that knowing, you know, even in a nomination, I remember kind of at least watching a clock to say, okay, I have to sell a certain number of memberships today. I know, you know, what that target is. That means on each door, I spend about this many minutes of time. For somebody who purchases a membership, there's, you know, obviously you're making more of a connection and you spend more time. So there is somewhat a formula to it, but I think there are some times where the connection just really matters. And I think you get a feeling for when that is.
Yeah, you got to be careful too about there is such a thing as the shrewd voter. And I'm not saying I was a shrewd voter, but before I got into politics, like if the NDP guy came to my door, I'd say, "Come on in, let's talk about dialectic materialism." I would tie the guy up for an hour, knowing that if he's an hour in my house, I'm not going to vote for him. He's not knocked on a bunch of doors. So you got to, and there are people like that, particularly in the rural areas. Who it's a game. How long can I tie this idiot up? You know?
When I ran, I found the teachers eerily friendly to the point where I was wondering if there was just some elaborate ruse just to prevent me from knocking on any other doors.
The shrewd voter.
I'll put this one out there because the transition from nomination to candidate can be a very stark one, because when you're seeking the nomination, it's just you. You are running on your own platform, for lack of a better term. You can say what you want, you can do what you want. Once you have that party banner behind you, and it depends on the party and the election, of course, you lose a lot of that autonomy as a candidate. You all of a sudden have an external platform that you have to stick to. You're given talking points. In some cases, you may not even be able to freely sign up for debates, interviews, things like this. How would you warn candidates about this or explain that? Because for a lot of people, again, especially those who have been in a professional career where they were the ones making the call, that can be a very humbling experience. And I don't know who wants to take that one first.
No, I'll let someone else go first. It's a tough one, Andrew.
Well, I think that part of this comes back to your theory of representation. Like there are these theories that have been around for a long time. One is a trusteeship theory, that you are the trustee of the interests of your constituents, and you have a lot of autonomy. You're a trustee. But are you playing that role? If you're playing that role, it affects how you relate to your party and how you relate to your constituents. There's the mandate theory that you run on a platform, you get somebody's support either in a nomination or in the election. You've now got a mandate. You don't have to run back to the riding every second Tuesday and ask, should we still balance the budget? I've got a mandate, and you're taking the direction from your mandate, part of which is for the party's platform. And then there's the so-called delegate theory that you're just the delegate of your constituents. Whatever they want, you will do that. And figuring out which of those are you going to be guided by will tell you about your relationship to the constituents and your relationship to the party. And a question I would have because this is one I've wrestled with, I should have told you in advance. What do you do? And you'll know what I'm talking about. When your personal position, and this really comes up on often moral and ethical issues, when your personal position is different from that of your party and is different from that of your constituents, and you got to vote on something. Are you guided by your personal convictions regardless of what, are you ultimately guided by the party line? And because if you step out of line, you can cause trouble. Or do you take your final guidance from your constituents, even if you don't agree with them? Well, like, how do you? I can tell you how I handled that, but I'd be interested in how you handled it.
I see Lisa nodding, so we'll go over to Lisa.
I have a live example. So CN Rail indicated they wanted to build an intermodal facility in the middle of Milton, which is the town that I represented. And it was very controversial, and 98% of Miltonians did not want to have this intermodal yard in their presence. And it went through the process in Ottawa, and it had to go through the environmental assessment and the CTA and all that kind of stuff. But they really wanted me to speak against it. They wanted me as a minister to shut down this whole process and just tell them to take their application and go away. And they felt very strongly about it. And it really hurt at the doors when I was running in 2015, the year that we lost. And I eventually did lose in 2019. And that was an issue that came up at the doors. You know, you didn't represent us on the most important thing that we cared about, Lisa. You could have stopped it. And the opposition parties were very good at saying, well, Lisa was a minister. She could stop this. So therefore, it's the adage that I always hate. I used it myself and I hate it, which is, you want your voice. The candidate says, I want to be your voice in Ottawa, not Ottawa's voice in the riding. And it's a killer. It's an absolute killer when it comes to campaigning.
Is there, looking back, a right answer to those dilemmas?
Well, I think it's not a generic answer, but one thing is to actually discuss that with your constituents in advance. And I've done that in some of the writings where I've said, look, I'm here to represent you to the maximum extent that I can, but there could be situations where the party's position, your position, my position is different, and this is how I will handle it. And I know one candidate who's now very prominent in the political arena. He was one of the few candidates that ever came to me in advance of seeking the nomination and asked, what do I do in that situation? And in his case, he had certain moral convictions. He said, if the party takes a different position, or I can't represent it. And so I said to him, well, tell your people that, and say, if you can't live with that kind of representation, then don't vote for me. And he actually got elected, and he actually got into some situations like that, and people would criticize him, but they couldn't say, well, you didn't tell us what you would do in that situation. I think that's one way of preparing for that, you know.
Well, let you jump in on this, Rebecca. Going back to the candidate part, because that is really where it starts, and the first time that you have to, in some way, surrender your individuality, at least a part of it. How do you navigate that?
Well, you know, I guess for me, I respected the fact that we run, you know, certainly provincially and federally as a party system. And so as somebody who wants to put my name forward on the ballot for that party representing a specific platform, you know, I understand that relationship, and I understand, you know, that the leader and the party, you know, drive a lot of voter behavior, and myself as a candidate, probably a smaller perspective or proportion of that. But I do think that there are always going to be times, you know, your example is a good one. Somebody did ask me that on the door, and I said, at the beginning, this is where I really had to think about what kind of MLA am I going to be? It's the same kind of candidate that I am right now, which at that point was, I don't have all the answers. I can't predict the kinds of issues that we're going to face, but what I can tell you is that there's going to be times that we disagree. There's going to be times where you're angry with a decision that a party or a government or a leader has made, and know that I will always show up to tell you why. And, we now have free votes in the legislature in Alberta, which I think is important because it does allow different MLAs to have a different voice and to vote independently of party. And so my approach to that, or my thoughts around that, are that however you do that, however you vote, you just have to be prepared to explain that to your constituents.
Yeah.
I want to ask another question here that I think is one that is a bit of a reality check for people here. When you're a candidate, you think, okay, I'm going to win, or I want to win, and when I get to Ottawa or Toronto or Edmonton or Victoria, I'm going to do all of this stuff. What were your expectations, Lisa? Did you think going into it that you were going to be able to do all of these things and have to have a bit of a reality check, or did you have pretty reasonable expectations going into serving in Ottawa about what you'd be able to do and what you'd hope to achieve in your first term?
I think I was, first of all, when you're elected and you go to Ottawa, Andrew, it's a humbling honor. I don't even know how to say it. Like, you're there and you're debating on the floor of the House of Commons, and it really can take your breath away, and it's extremely important. And you don't really think about the things that I want to accomplish at that point. What you're happy about right now is that, in our case, our party had won government. You were getting to know your caucus colleagues. You wanted to make sure that you helped the government implement the legislation that they had run on. That was the nice part about running for Conservatives, is that we always have plans, right? There are 5 things we want to accomplish, and this is what we're going to accomplish. And we did. And for me, that was very fulfilling, and that was very satisfying. When I got to my last term, there were some things that I did want to accomplish when I was in transport. And it is never difficult dealing with the politicians or your colleagues. The bureaucracy is fundamentally difficult to deal with. There is an inertia there that sometimes you have to push through. And I'll give you my example. One of the things I wanted to be able to do was get away from this rule we used to have where you had to stow your phone on takeoff and landing, because I knew the science that there was actually no scientific, rule for that. There is no reason why we had to do it. It was just something that made life easier, and they were erring on the side of caution. So I wanted to change that rule, and I think it took me 9 months to change a simple rule.
Well, so I have you to thank for that, for being able to do my crosswords on takeoff and landing on my phone. Well, thank you, Lisa. That's a job well done.
I can tell you one worse than that. Like, what reform was, because we were going to reform everything. You see, we're going to reform the Senate, we're going to reform the free votes in the House, we're going to reform everything. But we said we better start with something modest. Like, that's just, and so what we picked on, in the House of Commons, in the committees, they have these water pitchers. And the water pitchers are 2/3 ice and 1/3 water. And so the guests come, witnesses of that, to pour out they pour ice all over. The more ice has been spilled in Ottawa by that process. So we said, we're going to try to change the ratio of water to ice in those pitchers in the committee room. Do you think we could do that? We failed. we couldn't figure out.
You should have got Lisa on the job for you. She would have been able. In 9 months, she would have had it done.
An order in council, a law, a constitutional change. We could not get that one. So how are we going to fix the Senate if we can't fix the water? And really, it comes down to the entrenched way of doing things, and it's extremely hard to change. And it's not because the other people are mad or stubborn. It's just they've always done it that way, and you're trying to change it. It is not easy. It is not easy.
You went, Rebecca, from nomination candidate, and then MLA minister in a new government. Did you as well go into it with a particular set of expectations of what you'd be able to do that you found some resistance to when you got there?
I would say my approach or my kind of philosophy in all of this was that I am part of a team. So I am going to work hard, I am going to be a good teammate, and I am going to deliver on, jobs, economy, and supporting our energy industry, which essentially was the crux of our platform. And so, that is essentially my goal, is to be part of a team to move that forward and to deliver on the platform commitments that we made. And so, and maybe that was just my experience having worked in provincial government, that was kind of how I saw my role. But like Lisa said, I remember the first time I was up in Edmonton and, first met some of my caucus colleagues. And then the first time I walked into the legislature as an elected official, like, for me, that was the moment when all of a sudden I just felt this responsibility. Like, the constituents in Calgary Shaw chose me to represent them in this place. It is, of course, a privilege and an honor, but I also try to remind myself all the time, do not take that responsibility lightly, and that it's not forever.
When you got to Ottawa, what was the ice ratio, Lisa? I should have asked that. Have they fixed it yet?
No, but I think what they did was they used innovation, Preston, because they got these plastic pitchers that actually have a stopper on top of it and two little grids, so it prevents the ice from going out onto the glass.
Well, it took 30 years, but you got what you wanted out of that. As we wind down here, I want to take the politics out of it and talk about the personal a little bit. And we did touch on this a little bit earlier, that you do have a personal toll that it takes on you dealing with the attacks and of course the family commitment. But for people that have a family at home that they don't necessarily know if they want to leave by going to the capital, or even just a family that they're concerned about the work-life balance of. Because one thing as well, and if anyone knows an MP or MPP or MLA, when they're in their riding, it's not time off. It's a different full-time job that starts. They go from working morning to night at the capital to then working morning to night doing, every event and county fair and all of that. What is the message you'd send to people about that? Because you don't want to sugarcoat it, but at the same time, there's clearly a trade-off that makes it worth it for the three of you who have done this with your lives.
Well, I think for one thing that you and your partner had better be in agreement on this at the very beginning, and if there and a pretty frank discussion of what it's going to involve. I was extremely fortunate in Sandra's. So, like, we were starting a new party. So between 93 and 97, when we were trying to turn our regional party into a national party, my schedule was 50 days a year in Calgary, 100 days a year in Ottawa, and 200 days a year on the road, year after year after year. Now, it takes a pretty tolerant spouse, and we have 5 children. So I think this getting agreement at the front end is important. And I would caution people that have young children, particularly to wait until they're a little older. I mean, just for that'd be one piece of advice. People don't have to take it, but it can take a real toll on the family, and there better be agreement and understanding of what that is if you're going to get into it.
You didn't take that advice, so I want to hear your perspective on that, Rebecca.
When I decided to run, I remember being at the CA AGM, and I turned around, and a former MLA who had 4 children and also did this job when her children were quite young was asking me the questions about, do you know what this is going to look like? Have you thought through these different scenarios? And she said, she also did it when her children were young, and I had a 4-month-old daughter, and my son had just turned 3 when I decided to jump in on a nomination. And so there are pros and cons. The pro being that this is a normal life for them. Right? They don't know anything else than a life where I work way part-time and I'm at home when I'm at home. But I think, one of the things I think, and maybe this is more for women, I'm not sure, I think it's for both, parents of young children, knowing that we often say it takes a village to raise a child, and then we go off and we try to do everything ourselves and be everything to everybody. And I had to realize, I'm going to leave and I'm not going to be calling my husband to make sure he fed the kid broccoli. I don't care if they eat broccoli if they're happy. happy and they're reading, and they are sleeping well, and they're happy and they're playing. These are very good things. And so I had to let go of a few of the, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I had to let go of a few of those things. But, I think it's also just knowing that balance is never going to be perfect, and I don't know that balance is ever really a right word. There are times when I'm away and I am fully focused on work, and when I am away, I work very, very, very long days, so that when I'm at home, I can do constituency events, constituency phone calls. I take my kids to constituency events so that they can be part of the community. But then I'm also like a little bit judicious. If there's something nice to do that isn't in my constituency and isn't related to children's services specifically, it is okay sometimes to say no. And to at least try to find that time. But then when I'm at home with my family, I'm not checking my phone. I'm not working off the side of the couch. I am there with them.
That's, I think, a very, very important model that we just heard. And also to the kids watching, the Children's Services Minister says she doesn't care if you eat your broccoli. So there's some good news there. I'll go to you on this as well, Lisa. Did you find that it was easy to draw those lines?
No. So I had two very distinct situations. The first, like Rebecca, my kids were young. They were 6 and 3 when I went to Ottawa. I will tell you that if it was longer than an hour commute, like I had via an airline, I don't know whether or not I would have been able to do it, because having the ability to get home to my kids if something happened in a span of 2.5, 3 hours really mattered to me. So that was the first part, trying to get my head around what it would look like for the kids. So the kids now are 20 and 17. They grew up in politics. They are not hard partisans, but they are conservative, and they have conservative friends, and they talk about conservative stuff. So my youngest guy's in grade 12 now, and he just finished a project in his business class on leadership, and he picked me as one of the people that he would profile. And it was very interesting because although they lived it, they were so young, they had no concept of what was going on. So he found himself doing something which I do not recommend to any children, which is Googling your parent's name. And so he pulled up a lot of stuff. And I literally sent him a note after I read his project saying, if you want to talk in person about some of the stuff you read, I'm open and I'm happy to talk about anything that you came across. But what my son wrote in his project was this incredible sense of pride that I was a role model to so many of his classmates and his classmates' parents who say to him, your mother's a role model for my daughter. And that just gave him a complete sense of pride and accomplishment. And he helped me get there by being so easy kids when I was doing what I was doing as a minister. Flash forward to a totally different story, Andrew, to be honest. My husband was diagnosed with young onset Alzheimer's in 2016. And we knew there was something wrong in 2013. I just didn't know what it was. And if he had been diagnosed a year earlier, I don't know whether or not I would have run in 2015, to be honest, because that is a much bigger hurdle. Having a chronically ill spouse with that terrible disease is a leveler in terms of what you can possibly do. There's no way I was going to represent my constituents with my full heart, knowing that my husband was declining and my time with him was limited. It would be lengthy, but it was limited in terms of good cognition. So when I got elected in 15, and then I ran for leader, and then Bruce got his diagnosis, I said to Andrew Scheer, and God love him, he gave me the latitude. I said, I'm really going to have to swing my schedule so my husband isn't alone, because I don't want him to be alone thinking about this terrible disease. And Andrew said, fine, we'll work this out. We'll figure out how to make it all happen. And we did. But I also cut back on local events, and I cut back on riding things. And I did work for the party. And some of you may not have thought that I took my foot off the accelerator, but I did. And I often wonder whether or not that really fed into the fact that I eventually lost in 2019. Why did I run in 19? I ran because I guess I had made a promise. But not winning in 19 has been better for my husband.
Well, I very much appreciate your candor on that and all of your other advocacy, Lisa. So thank you for that. Just in the remaining time here, I'm going to give everyone 15 seconds to answer one question here. One thing you wish someone had told you before you were a candidate for the first time. We'll start with you, Rebecca.
I'll say I was lucky that I didn't have to wish, because I did actually have people to remind me that this is really just, it is hard work. Knocking on doors is hard work. It is very humbling work as well, but that it is 100% worth it. Even, you know, the last 20 months have not been what I ever expected my life in politics to be. But I can say I wouldn't change a thing. I would do it again. It is hard work, but it is always worth it.
Thank you very much. 15 seconds, Preston. Go.
I'd say the House is not a home, and don't try to make it that.
Very good. And you have 10 extra seconds, thanks to Preston's brief answer, Lisa.
I'm brief too, and I learned it on my first campaign. You are not the campaign manager. The candidate is not the campaign manager. Your job is to go out and smile and work with constituents. Leave everything else to the team that you've assembled.
That is very, very sound advice. I want to thank Lisa Raitt, Rebecca Shulz, and Preston Manning for their candor. It's been a fascinating conversation. I hope you've learned something from it here. And with that, I want to thank you as well for indulging me as a moderator here. We'll go back to the man with the plan on this event, Troy Lanigan. Thank you so much.